Good morning. I hope you're doing well on this beautiful Sunday morning. I want to speak to you for a few minutes about the gospel. We use this word often in different ways. We talk about gospel songs, we talk about gospel meetings, and I've even heard a program called the Gospel Hour. What is the gospel? This morning we're going to look for a few minutes in Philippians chapter 1. The Apostle Paul was the apostle of the gospel. Paul is in prison, probably in the city of Caesarea. He is writing a letter to one of his favorite congregations, the church in Philippi. In this letter, in the first chapter, we see that he uses the word gospel 6 times. Let's look at these references. First, in verse 3, he says, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, for you all making my prayer with joy, because of your partnership in the gospel from this day until now. They were partners in the gospel. Next, we look at verse 7. Paul writes, It is right for me to feel this way about you all, because I hold you in my heart, for you are all partakers with me of grace, both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel. Next, we'll read in verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Now, in verse 15, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. And finally, in verse 27, he mentions gospel twice. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. So Paul was all about the gospel. Well, the question naturally is, just what is the gospel? Paul answers that in one sense in Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. There he says, For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to all those who believe, both Jew and Greek. What does the word gospel mean? We find the answer to that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. In verse 3, Paul writes, For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for your sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. So the gospel is simply the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and the salvation we receive through his blood shed on the cross. That's good news. Paul says that his imprisonment has led to the sharing of the gospel, and in some unique ways. Because he was imprisoned, he was able to share the gospel with the imperial guard. These were chosen soldiers in a special brigade. Some of you will recall the Republican Guard. These were the special soldiers appointed by Saddam Hussein. You'll recall the conflict when the United States invaded Iraq. Paul says that he was able to share the gospel with these guards who were around him all the time. This tells us something about the apostle, doesn't it? He took advantage of the situation. You see, they could imprison Paul, but they couldn't shut him up. He would still talk about the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. Let me use a simple illustration to show what Paul was all about. Some of our ladies wear perfume. and we like that fragrance. You know that when you put that perfume on, it goes with you everywhere you go. In the same way, the Apostle Paul was filled with the gospel. And everywhere that Paul went, the gospel went too. And so wherever he was, the gospel was always shared. This is really our responsibility because Jesus has told us to go and teach the gospel. And so we need to take the gospel with us, and we need to share it wherever we happen to go. We need to be careful because sometimes Christians play the if only game. If only I had more time, I'd share the gospel with someone else. If only I had more money, I could share the gospel with someone. If only my health was better, then I could share the gospel. If only I wasn't so busy, then I could share the gospel. That's not the way it was with Paul. You see, sharing the gospel was what Paul was all about, so wherever he went, he shared the gospel. And so sharing the good news about Christ should be natural for us as well. Surely we don't want the day to come when we stand before the Lord in judgment and we say, if only I had shared the gospel with someone else. No, so we need to be going everywhere, sharing the good news about Christ. Paul also says that his boldness encouraged others to share the gospel. If he could share the gospel while he was in prison, surely they could share the gospel when they were not. It's the same today. We send missionaries around the world. They go to strange nations, unfamiliar culture, sharing the gospel with people that they don't even know. If they're willing to make those kind of sacrifices to share the gospel, can't we share the gospel with a friend, with a coworker, or a neighbor? Surely we can. Let's look at a second thing about the gospel. Paul says the gospel affected how he looked at death. He didn't look at death with anxiety, but with anticipation. Look at verse 20. Paul writes, "It is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Not many people look forward to death and say it would be better, but that's what the Apostle Paul did. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 13, Paul wrote that we don't grieve like others who have no hope. Going to a funeral when it's not a Christian is not a pleasant experience because it's the end of a life. It's the loss of a loved one. And so people are in great grief. When a Christian dies, we grieve too. Only because we won't be with this one for a short while, and so they'll be missed. But really we celebrate because our brother or sister has lived for Christ, and they have looked forward to the day when they'll be in heaven, in paradise, with God our Father. In Revelation chapter 14 and verse 13 it says, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord." They are blessed because they have received the ultimate goal that they've worked so hard for. When our soldiers are overseas, they look back and they miss being at home. They long to be back with their loved ones. That's what home is all about, isn't it? Paul says, we would prefer to be away from this body and be at home with the Lord. Do you know that is truly our home? This home will pass, this body will die, but being with our Savior in heaven will be for eternity. It is our true home. So we don't have anxiety for death, but we have anticipation. The next thing we see in this letter is that the gospel was Paul's life. Look at verse 21. Paul says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me." Paul says what his purpose in life was. For me to live is Christ. And he says his labor will be for the Lord. Ask yourself this question: what is the purpose in your life? How would you fill in the blank? For me to live is family. Well, surely it is. We spend most of our time either in our job or with our family. Or maybe it is your job. For me to live is, and you fill in your job. Or maybe it's some goal that you have. For me to live is to accomplish something. Maybe it's a material goal. Maybe you're working for a good retirement. Maybe for you to live is something you want to do, somewhere you want to go, somewhere you want to travel. Well, these are all worthy goals. But what about Paul's goal? For me to live is Christ. Ask yourself this question, for surely it applies. One day we will all die. Family and friends will honor us and they'll write an obituary. It will describe some things about us, how they feel about us, and some of the things maybe we accomplished in life. But if they were to describe us and say, well, Gary was all about, and you fill in the blank, what would it be? Gary was all about his family. Gary was all about his job. Gary was all about his hobby. Gary was all about the places that he traveled. If it doesn't say that Gary was all about Christ, then really we have lost. Because when Paul said, for me to live is Christ, he also said to die is gain. And so one comes with the other. Most people today are deceived by our culture. They think life is all about getting ahead. And so they scramble, they work hard every day to build up the bank account, build up the retirement, get the bigger home, drive the nicer car, get the kids through college, have a good retirement. All of these things are part of life, aren't they? But remember, Jesus asked this question: what good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world, yet loses his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? You know, all the things that I've mentioned will one day be left behind. They're temporary. But one thing won't ever be lost if we have it, and that is Christ. See, we have him now in life, and if we die in the Lord serving him, then we will gain Christ, and that we will go to heaven and be in his presence. There is a truth I think that every Christian must learn. We don't sacrifice our happiness to find Christ. We find it. Jesus said, whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. You know, we're not cheating our families if we serve Christ. We're not cheating our employer if we serve Christ. And we're not really cheating even ourselves if we serve Christ. Because whatever sacrifice we happen to make, the return will be much greater, first of all, in this life. Surely we are blessed in our service to Christ. But even more so when we die, someday we will go to be with the Lord. Paul found that the key to happy living is living for the gospel. When? Every day. Where? Wherever you go. How? And whatever you do. Live for Christ. Think about two people going on vacation. One has no plan. He makes no preparation at all. He hasn't researched any information on his destination, made no reservations, hasn't done any packing. Now it's time to go. He's unprepared, isn't he? But another plans for his vacation. He researches the destination. He finds the best motel. He gets the best reservation. He begins packing and preparing for his vacation. And finally the time comes. And when he goes, he's prepared and he enjoys a wonderful vacation. Which one was wise? Friend, that's just talking about vacation. What about our eternal destiny? Will we be prepared, ready to go, to be with Christ? I ask you this morning, will you be wise? Prepare for your eternal destination.